I am in the series of Finding Your Story with the belief that as we look at the unique stories of our lives, especially along certain themes, then we can get a sense of God's presence, a sense of God's direction in and for our lives. We are going to be dealing next week with stories of suffering, and then the following closing week, stories of forgiving. But today on Dr. Martin Luther King weekend, appropriately, we're going to explore stories of prejudice. Would you please join me in prayer? Lord our God, would you please give us a portion of your Spirit, pour it out into these words and into these feelings, so that we might, at the end of this service, hear even better your word and your claim upon our lives. Amen. Prejudice. Here is a definition. The act or state of holding unreasonable, preconceived judgments or convictions. An adverse judgment or opinion formed unfairly or without knowledge of the facts. Irrational suspicion or hatred of a particular social group, such as a race or the adherents of a religion. Bottom line, it is an emotional, irrational thing that every one of us here participates in every day, multiple times a day, without even thinking about it. That is an awe-inspiring thought, isn't it? But it's true. Because we are ingrained. Maybe it's a primordial, primitive, caveman type of thing to prejudge people for the basis of safety that we keep within our own, and they keep, whoever they might be, within their own safety. So we prejudge even this sermon, even me. Because if you're a member of this church, come here for a while, you know me. You know my background, you know my appearance, you know the way I preach, my biases, and what have you. But what would happen if the same sermon you were about to hear from me came from this woman? Or this man? Or anybody else who's quite a bit different from this young man you're seeing here? You know? What would happen? Because you form opinions, and whether you believe what I say or what this person says or not is based on your perception, your experiences with that type of person. That's the way it is. And if anything, the tragedy in the aftermath of Ferguson has brought this to a head. Just when we think that the racism and the issues of economic injustice and et cetera might be pretty clean and clear and calm, after all, if you saw Selma, the Voting Act's right, passed in 65, everything's fine, right? Of course not. And then the turmoil of Ferguson and post-Ferguson just brings it to bear. How we make judgments in all cases. One woman in this church, I asked you all to give me stories that would relate to the different themes. And in terms of prejudice, she sent me a story. And this story related to how she attended a worship service we had here in the aftermath of the grand jury verdict. And she said she was attending our service. I sat down by someone I knew, as most of us do. And during this wonderful, uplifting service, I looked around and saw many sitting alone, especially an African-American woman in front of me. This seemed that something was totally out of sync. And while we prayed for peace and improvement in racial relations with our mouth, we were being discriminating in our church. I decided to talk with my feet instead of my mouth. I moved up to sit by this woman, our neighbor and Christian, not because I'm such a wonderful person, but because I couldn't be there praying and not acting. So prejudice is painful when we are the recipients of it and when we are the perpetrators of it. And as we advance into this new year, what a great New Year's resolution to be able to be a little more conscious of those snap judgments we make when we see the news stories or we encounter people, especially different from us, in any capacity. Now, this morning, I want to bring up two stories of prejudice. One involving Jesus and one involving Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to intertwine what we learn from these stories in terms of how we as Christians can get a perspective on this pervasive sin of prejudice. So, for the first story, the story of when Jesus encountered prejudice, I would invite you to listen to this reading from John.
Our reading today comes from John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51, the Message. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. When he got there, he ran across Philip and said, "Come, follow me." Philip's hometown was Bethsaida, the same as Andrew and Peter. Philip went and found Nathanael and told him, "We found the one Moses wrote of in the law, the one preached by the prophets. It's Jesus, Joseph's son, the one from Nazareth." Nathanael said, "Nazareth? You've got to be kidding." But Philip said, "Come, see for yourself." When Jesus saw him coming, he said, "That's a real Israelite, not a false bone in his body." Nathanael said, "Where'd you get that idea? You don't know me." Jesus answered, "One day, long before Philip called you here, I saw you under the fig tree." Nathanael exclaimed, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You've become a believer simply because I say I saw you one day sitting under the fig tree? You haven't seen anything yet. Before this is over, you're going to see heaven open and God's angels descending to the Son of Man and ascending again."
To really appreciate what you just heard, understand that Nazareth was a backwoods town, Hickville, if you will. And so when Nathanael hears that the Messiah is from Nazareth, he's thinking, Nazareth, where all those Gentiles are. You see, if memory serves, there's a big rock quarry in Nazareth, and you had a lot of Gentiles coming there for work, for labor, and so since you had more of a proportion of Gentiles, it was more of an unclean city. So Jews there were tainted by those dirty people. The Messiah coming from there, you've got to be kidding. And yet you notice that when Jesus sees Nathanael coming, he does not run away, but he engages him in a conversation. I don't know about you, but if you have an enemy, someone who's prejudged you, someone who thinks you're tacky and thinks of you, gives you all these characteristics without even knowing you, your initial inclination is not to have anything to do with the person. But not Jesus. Jesus showed compassion, even to a bigot. Dr. Martin Luther King, in the last year of his life, really confronted people who were prejudiced against him. Now, it happened, of course, all throughout the civil rights movement. But exactly 1 year before he was assassinated, he gave a speech condemning the Vietnam War. First time he ever did that. His advisors had counseled him not to do that at all costs, but in his conscience he knew it was the right thing to do. So in his speech, he said that you think America is the greatest nation on earth. America is the greatest perpetrator of violence on this earth. That America must pursue its moral integrity with just as much passion as it is killing people in Southeast Asia. No sooner had he finished this speech than it all rained down upon him. People in his own movement said, "You've just taken away the emphasis upon civil rights and justice for us." People in the government said, "Now we have him. Now we have proof that he is an agitator and a communist." People in the militant Black Panther Party said, "Look how out of touch he is, talking about the war when we're talking about racism here." From every side, Dr. King was hounded. If you want more detail about it, I would invite you to read Tavis Smiley's book, Death of a King, which goes into great detail about how this remarkable man kept his faith when it would be very easy just to give it all up. But the amazing thing was that when he was bombarded with all of this, you know what he did? Here's an example. He flew into Cleveland to give a speech. He was running late, and in the car from the airport to where he was speaking, stopped at an intersection, red light, and he turned, and there was a small group of young black prostitutes, and they recognized Dr. King, and they start calling him names. Look, there's old Uncle Tom. Hey, look, why don't you just go on back to Georgia? Light turns green. He proceeds through it, and as he does so, he keeps thinking about what he just saw and what he just heard. And even though he was going to be late for his speech, he had the driver turn around, went back, got out, and started talking to those young women. They talked, and he said finally, I want to hear your story. I don't have time now, but if you like, I want to talk to you all later. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, 12 black prostitutes go into the hotel where he's staying, go up to the desk clerk, and the desk clerk basically faints. But Dr. King hears it, gets his colleagues. He and his colleagues have sandwiches brought to the conference room. And Dr. King, in the presence of about a dozen hookers, asked to hear each of their stories, their feelings, their perspectives. That is called compassion, even to those who call you names. It's also called being non-defensive. If you note, Jesus, when Nathanael saunters up to him, does not start the conversation with, Nathanael, let's talk about Nazareth. You know, you're a pretty bigoted guy, aren't you? I need to tell you that we're not all. He could have pursued that line of conversation, couldn't he? What did he do instead? He starts engaging him in a very open conversation, not trying to get his viewpoint across, but, as we'll see in a moment, a very non-judgmental, interesting way. And so did Dr. King. When hounded with, here's what I think you're doing, Dr. King never publicly grew defensive and hostile and angry, at least as far as I could read in that book or remember from Dr. King. There was one time when he was giving a speech. It was an anti-war speech, and he was being heckled mercilessly. It was one of those speeches where he had the little gems of wisdom that are part of his legacy. It was a speech that he said, we need each other. The black man needs the white man to save him from his fear. The white man needs the black man to save him from his guilt. Beautiful. But it wasn't heard very well because of the catcalls coming from his audience. So do you know what Dr. King did? He did that which I would never have done. If I was being heckled during a speech, I would start speaking faster and louder and then get off the stage. Dr. King stopped, and a person in the front row who was the loudest heckler, he said, would you like to come up here so that we can all hear more of what's on your mind? And the heckler did. He goes up, gets behind the lectern, and he says, Dr. King, I fought in Vietnam. I fought for freedom. I didn't fight for communists, and I didn't fight to get sold down the river. Loud applause and stuff. And the heckler goes on and on. And you know what Dr. King said when he was finished? Dr. King's only response was, we just want our boys who are fighting over there to come home safely. That's all. Not defensive, not argumentative, not, don't you see my point of view? He was just open. That silenced that heckler, but not the others. The strength of your position is when you don't need to defend it, but you let the truth of it speak for itself. Jesus did that. Dr. King did that. You meet hate with compassion. You meet confrontation with openness. And there's one other thing that you do, you dare do, and it takes a strong person to do it. You put things in perspective. How did Jesus talk to Nathanael? Love the way he did it. First words out of his mouth, "Behold, I can tell that you're a righteous dude." That's a paraphrase. I can tell you're a man without sin. I can tell that you are a saint. That is like seeing someone go into your refrigerator in your garage and just clean out whatever you have, and you catch them in the act, running out, and you say, "I have never seen anybody as holy as you. Have a good day." You know what the thief would do? You know what the bigot would do? What are you talking about? And Jesus went on to catch him. And because Jesus was humorously sarcastic, if you will, they engaged in the conversation. It broke down the defenses of Nathanael, and Nathanael became a follower because of that amazing man who was compassionate, open, and just funny. The amazing thing with Dr. King, in his last year as one domino of hate and anger fell against him, leading to another and to another, as he doubted himself, as he fought bouts of depression, he never, even to the end, lost his sense of humor. Just shortly before his assassination, he was on the Tonight Show. And before things got serious about an upcoming march on Washington and so forth, Dr. King said this, "I flew out of Washington this afternoon, and as soon as we started out, they notified us that the plane had mechanical difficulties. Finally, we took off and landed. And whenever I land after mechanical difficulties, I'm always very happy. Now, I don't want to give the impression that as a Baptist preacher, I don't have faith in God in the air. It's simply that I've had more experience with Him on the ground." And then he went on to say that he caught a taxi to take him to the studio for the show, and he told the driver that, and this was sort of silly, I'm going to be late, would you please hurry? To a New York cabbie, that's like throwing gas on fire, you know. And so this cabbie took off, darting in and out of traffic, and Dr. King said, "I had to modify my request. I told the driver, I'd rather be known as the Dr. King who arrives late than to be known as the late Dr. King." And shortly thereafter, he was assassinated. What a man. To the end, he knew what it was like to feel the hate and pain of prejudice, and he knew what the Christian call was to confront it. May we remember the stories of these two amazing people, our Messiah and Dr. King. We confront ourselves and we confront outward expressions of prejudice with compassion, with openness, and even daring to have a sense of humor, putting it all in perspective. And to put this sermon in perspective, let me end it with the way Dr. King ended one of his last sermons. I don't know if this was the very last. We know that the night before he was assassinated, he had an impromptu sermon, speech where he talked about being on the mountaintop. But this precedes this, and this is how he concluded that other sermon. "If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then, I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention I have 300 or 400 awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to be able to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. Say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. Say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. Say that day I was a drum major. Say that day I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. For us, that's all he needs to say.